The end of the world is upon us. Time for one last desperate act to see if we can stop it from happening. Hello everybody and welcome to this light novel review. I'm Justice R. Stone, and on this channel I cover all things light novels, reviews like this one, countdowns of the top 10 most popular light novels in Japan on a weekly basis, posting the light novel podcast here, as well as bits of news as well. So if you love light novels, or maybe you're just starting to get interested in them, you should consider subscribing. In this video I'm going to be covering volume number 4 of Takaya Kagami's light novel series, Seraph of the End, Gurin Ichinose, Catastrophe at 16. This one is released officially in English by Vertical. If you'd like to pick up your own copy, I've got links in the description to Amazon and the Book Depository. Now, just a little bit of groundwork about this series first. First of all, in Japan, these were released as seven separate volumes. Now, Vertical, because they're not long, they're only about 170 or so pages. So what Vertical did was, for volumes 1 through 6, they released 2 books at a time in single omnibuses, and then volume 7 was released as its own volume. So you'll see volume 4 on this, but when you open to the first page it says volume 7, so that would be why. I'll refer to this as volume number 4 and the other volumes as 1, 2, and 3, just because that's how I experienced them in English. Also of note, this is a prequel series to the manga Seraph of the End, which also did have an anime adaptation. And in Japan, there is a sequel to this series, which is still a prequel to Seraph of the End manga, and it is Gurin Ichinose World Resurrection at 19. So set 3 years after this series takes place, and this series takes place 8 years before Seraph of the End, the manga. Now this series and Gurin Ichinose at 19 and the manga are all written by the same author, so there is a consistent tone, and this is all officially part of the one big Seraph of the End series. This isn't like some kind of fan spin-off or anything like that. This is actually the author writing out his planned vision for this story. Now, because of how long it took for this to get released in Japan and then get licensed in English and translated and everything else, it's been 2 years since I read volume number 3 of this series, so I was kind of curious just how quickly I'd be able to get into this volume. And the answer was actually surprisingly pretty quick. I read the last couple pages of volume number 3 just to kind of be like, okay, where does it end? And when I picked up this one, it takes place just a mere minutes before the end of volume number 3. So really, no time gaps, no jumps or anything like that. It is bang right away, picking up basically where volume number 3 left off. And that is with Gurin, Shinya, and their friends basically deciding that they are going to contact Mahiru, who has been pretty much orchestrating this whole oncoming catastrophe, and they're going to try and make it seem like they're siding with her so that they can get close to her and potentially A, find out what she's got planned, and B, stop it from happening. The problem is that to do that, it's going to basically pit them against the entire Imperial Order of Demons. And so the bulk of this book is our friends fighting their way through one violent clash to the next, trying to finally get to Mahiru to try and save the world. Now, one of the strengths of this series for me has always been the characters. I really like Gurin as a main character. He's one of those relatable heroes, you know. He starts off in volume number 1, this outsider kid, the kid that people look down on because of his family and everything else. But secretly, he's been working really hard to be able to exceed the limitations of his birthright in order to try and bring honor and such back to his family. But at heart, he's a decent guy, and because of that, he starts having friendships with some rather unexpected people that you would think, given his situation and his status, that these people would actually be his natural enemies. But it just shows that, again, when you have a character who is charismatic and driven, but also is a decent person, he can overcome so many limitations. And that's one thing that I've really liked about this series, is that not only is Gurin a relatable hero on a relatable hero's journey, but the friendships that he develops seem really cool. They're natural. I like the other characters. There's been some really good moments in the previous volumes of just slice of life moments. You know, these characters just hanging out at Gurren's apartment playing video games and such, and, you know, eating cakes and good food. And I've actually really liked those slice of life moments. And I think it's important because if you are familiar even a little bit with Seraph of the End, the manga, or the anime, you know that there's kind of a foregone conclusion to this series. There's never a doubt just where this series is going to end. The question is, how is it going to happen? And, you know, what's going to happen to these characters as that happens? Like, how are they going to be wrapped up in it? So really, the only two things driving this book and making you really get into it is, how are things going to go down, and what's going to happen to these characters that I like? And I do like these characters. And I also like the fact that Gurren himself is somewhat self-aware. He is not a character who thinks so highly of himself that he doesn't acknowledge his limitations. In fact, it's kind of funny because there's almost a slightly meta moment in this book where Gurren kind of has this revelation that, hey, you know, maybe we're not even the main characters in this whole thing. Like, maybe what we're doing right now doesn't really even matter in the grand scheme of things. Maybe there's some other hero who's going to come along and actually sort this junk out. But regardless, we should still do what we can. We should still push ahead just in case. And I say it's kind of meta because, of course, in Seraph of the End, the manga, there is a different main character, and that main character we do see a couple of times throughout this series, and in fact those are kind of the slower moments of this volume, is kind of building up that story of Yuichiro, who is eventually going to be the main character in Seraph of the End, the manga. So we see him a couple of times throughout this book, and it's kind of setting him up for what is good, where he's going to be when that manga happens and everything else. It's kind of putting all of these things into play. Now again, I have very, very minimal knowledge of the Seraph of the End manga. I basically just kind of know the gist of what it's about. So I've read these light novels with zero experience of the manga. So you can definitely enjoy these books without having read the manga. Although I will say that there have been times throughout the series, and definitely with Yuichiro's story, like the kind of things that are happening in this volume, I thought to myself, you know, I'd probably be getting more out of these things, these moments in this book, if I knew more about his story come Seraph of the End. Like, I kind of feel like there are definitely nods in this series to people that are fans of the manga, that fans of the manga are going to get a bit more out of this series because they have a better idea of where these characters end up 8 years after this series ends. But nonetheless, you can still certainly enjoy it. And I mean, this volume is filled with tons of action. And surprisingly, even though it's not very long, it's only about 170 some pages, it still manages to pack a couple of pretty hefty plot twists into this story. In fact, there's one particular plot twist that made me go, wow, like, I kind of have to reevaluate the entire series so far now. Like, now that this character's motivations are a lot clearer, it's like, wow, it's just, it changes so much, and yet it doesn't seem to be that big of a reveal, but yeah, so there's still definitely some twists in this last volume. And if you've read the first 3 up until this point, you know that this series has been filled with all sorts of betrayals and twists and turns, and this person's a double, triple, quadruple agent to this. And yeah, I mean, but it makes sense ultimately. And when you get to the climax, which I definitely will not ruin, when you get to the climax, it really feels earned. It really has an impact because of the journey that these characters have been on throughout the series. So I really liked this final volume. If anything, probably my only little complaint about this volume would just be that this book very much becomes Shinya and Guren's book. Even though our other four are in it, and even though they have a couple of moments where they shine a little bit, it's still definitely about this relationship between Shinya and Guren. And it makes sense given their relationship to Mahiru, and also because the two of them, in terms of political and physical power, are the closest to being equals. But it made me kind of long a little bit for those chill apartment video game sessions that I liked in the previous series, or like previous books. So there's a little bit of the character development at this point is kind of backseated a little bit, because again, we're just basically hitting the ground running towards the end, so there's not a lot of time given to that. I'm glad that there was a couple of times that they did, but they feel very different because, of course, this is a very pressure situation. This isn't a let's wait and see kind of stuff that we had in the previous volumes, or a we need to just chill and relax so that we can get our strength back like we had in previous volumes. This is very much a we are under constant attack, pressure, timeline, deadline. So it makes even those little character moments feel very different from the previous books. Again, I'm glad that they were present, and they are very important, especially when you kind of get to the end of the book, to make it all sort of come together. But like I said, I kind of missed those little more slice of life moments because I had fun with those in the previous volumes. So all in all, this comes to a really excellent conclusion for this series. It's a conclusion that, well, I mean, completely lives up to the name, essentially. Like I said, it's all pretty much a foregone conclusion, but it's been a really cool ride, and it was really interesting to sort of see it, how it played out in the end, particularly. Really has me thinking I've got to find some time to squeeze in some Seraph of the End manga to read, because I want to see what happens to these characters beyond this, and I'm kind of fingers crossed that maybe Vertical will deliver the Guren Ichinose World Resurrection at 19 series, because I'd like to read that one as well, because as much as I want to read Seraph of the End and see what the world is 8 years after this, it would be, to me, a little bit cooler even just to sort of see 3 years, because it's just long enough for changes, but still these characters are still going to be closer to who they are in this book than probably who they are, 8 years later. So anyway, fingers crossed. If Vertical, hey, if you're watching, you could pick that up. I wouldn't complain, and I would definitely read it. But in any case, as I said, this has been a really good series. I'm very glad that I got a chance to check it out, and I got to pick up the manga at the very least so I can get a little bit more of this series into my life. So recently I read ReZero Volume 7, which was a big monster hunt with blood and death and violence, and now I've read about the end of the world, so I kind of thought, maybe I need something a little light and fluffy. So my next review is going to be volume number 2 of I've Been Killing Slimes for 300 Years and Maxed Out My Level. This series, I can only say for volume number 1, it was such a chill, kind of warm your heart, check your mind out for a little while kind of read, which, is really kind of refreshing every now and then after, like I said, you've had a couple of volumes of pure hectic violence, doom, gloom, end of the world kind of stuff. So that'll be my next review. So if you're brand new to the channel and you love light novels, or you're just starting to get interested in them, you should consider subscribing. I do reviews like this on a weekly basis, as well as weekly countdowns of the top 10 best-selling light novels in Japan. There's news, and the Light Novel Podcast gets posted here as well. Thank you so much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Till then, bye-bye for now.